The ProAct Know-How, brought to you by ProAct.
Hi, it's ProAct Sam. Welcome along to this episode of Living and Working Abroad. Thanks for listening in, and we've produced a checklist for expats of 10 things to follow as Brexit unfolds. And I thought we'd go through this in detail in this vlog to make sure that you as an expat can follow the 10 points that are going to change. First of all, the first point is that the UK is no longer in the EU. So still lots of talk about the EU, but legally the UK is no longer in the EU. It's left on the 31st of January, and so the UK can't actually go back now. In theory, the law says, under the international treaty that's been signed between the EU and the UK, that the UK would have to make a whole new application to rejoin the EU. So that's a non-starter. There's no undoing Brexit now. It's been passed into law by the EU and the UK. The second point is the UK has left the EU, but nothing's changed. We've entered a period of transition where effectively things stay the same for a certain period of time. And generally that is 31st of December. So the world didn't end, planes didn't fall out of the sky, the world pretty much carries on as it is, but it is different and things will change and evolve over the period. Some of those will become into force and be announced during the transition period and take effect from the 1st of January next year. There are some exemptions, and again we'll go through this in the checklist, but just need to be aware that there are some overruns, but essentially the relationship between UK expats relocating, moving to live and work abroad in the EU, and EU expats moving to work in the UK as EU citizens finishes on the 31st of December this year. Nothing changes, but during that transition period, an EU expat can still relocate to the UK, and a UK expat can still relocate to the EU. So in practice, you can still choose to go and live and work in another EU country as long as you've made that move before the 31st of December this year. The third point is under the withdrawal treaty, the third point says the EU citizens' rights are protected. So the withdrawal treaty is an international treaty. The UK is outside the EU, but certain things are protected. And one of those is the rights of EU citizens. What does that mean? The EU has, under its charters, this 4 freedoms for EU citizens to freely to move themselves, their money, their business and the services around the EU. That doesn't mean it's entirely free to move. They've still got a registration in the different countries. So, it's a controlled freedom of movement, but freedom of movement nonetheless. That is protected for everybody who's an existing expat before the end of the transition period. So even if you haven't relocated yet, an EU citizen can relocate to the EU before the end of December 2020. A UK expat can relocate into Europe to Portugal, Spain, Cyprus, Greece, France before the end of the year and start their residency under EU citizens' rights and have the option to live and work in that country for the rest of their lives. And it is that country. An EU expat in the UK will have freedom of movement going backwards and forwards to the UK and their home country, and as an EU citizen can still move around the EU. A UK expat can have freedom of movement to live and work in Cyprus or Spain or Portugal, but only between that country, that one country in which they're resident, and the UK. So moving on to point 4, you need to check and monitor what the requirements are to register. So EU expats now need to formally register. The UK operates a system where there isn't a formal register ID system like the EU countries. So now they need to put that in place. So you can huff and puff from a UK perspective, but actually you're only doing what you would have had to do in any EU country anyway. So UK expats in the EU understand this. So you have to register for that settled status. But that settled status is to say you've been living and working in the UK for 5 years, or living with your family in the UK for 5 years. If you've not done that, you can still register as pre-settled status and then acquire the 5 years and remain in the UK for the rest of your life. But you must register in the UK that you're resident and you're living there before the 31st of December this year. For UK expats, they probably have already done an initial registration in their country. So they've got a freedom of movement to move there, but they should have registered formally. If they haven't, they've got to the 31st of December to do that this year. And then again, that starts the ticking of the 5-year permanent residency. But a UK expat should always upgrade to that 5-year permanent residency, as the EU call the equivalent of settled status, as soon as they're able to, because other rights come from that. And permanent residency and settled status is not citizenship, it's not naturalisation, but it's a part of that. So it's something well worth having. The fifth point is that when you're working abroad, you've still got to pay social and tax. There is an EU social welfare agreement, which the UK have offered to remain part of and reciprocate with the EU countries. Now, an agreement needs to be made going forward on how reciprocal that nature will be, and the UK can make bilateral agreements with individual countries, or it can make a bilateral agreement with the EU representing all 27 remaining countries. So that is a big area that we need to understand is going to happen. But meanwhile, if an expat is living and working in the UK or in Cyprus or Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Holland, any EU country, once they're registered to live and work, they can stay living and working. And if they're paying their social insurance and tax, they qualify for local social insurance benefits. Not necessarily on a par of a citizenship right, so they may not have a right to vote, but they'll have a right of equal treatment under EU citizen rules. Point 6 is that businesses may need a branch. So a business, like an individual, has got freedom of movement under EU rules and to trade and provide services across border. Some regulations may come in. So the EU is a closed economy with high tariffs coming from people wanting to import into the EU. And those tariffs could be applied to the UK imports from the EU from 2021. This is all to be wait and seen. So a business may want to create an EU branch or subsidiary company that could then provide those services without the tariffs that would go on. That might mean a branch office, employees, relocation of individuals. Talk to us at Private Partnership if that need is representative of your business. Point 7, what about your overseas property? Now, some countries, if you take countries outside the EU, you get countries like Thailand. You can't own local property. You have to buy that property, that real estate, in partnership with a local. And that existed in some EU countries before the EU came along. But under EU rules, EU citizens can buy property anywhere in the EU. And those rules will remain for EU citizens. So if you're registered, you'll still be able to retain and own your property. If you're not registered, the rules might change. And there are still some EU countries that require local ownership for non-EU citizens. So it's something to monitor and watch as it unfolds with new bilateral or EU agreements between the UK and the EU. Point 8 is healthcare. It's a big one here. Again, we've covered already that if you're living and working paying social insurance, then and taxes, then your eligibility for local welfare benefits can be accrued. You might need to be there for some time as a non-EU citizen, but you can accrue them. Those under the EU health system, there's a reciprocal arrangement where a UK citizen in the EU can get those benefits, but they're actually still paid for from the UK. That could be short-term working contracts, it could be students, it could be people with medical conditions, and it could be retired people with a state retirement age and an S1. So those healthcare arrangements could stop. Now the UK has got bilateral agreements already with countries outside the EU, like New Zealand, like Canada, like Mauritius, like the Falkland Islands, like Gibraltar. So there is still, the UK can have bilateral agreements. It had bilateral agreements with Cyprus and Ireland and Malta before they joined up the EU with the EU health scheme. So there's no reason why the UK can't create new bilateral agreements. The UK is committed to maintaining the existing system of healthcare for expats abroad with the EHC cards and the S1s, but they won't be the EU scheme. They will need to either have an EU-wide agreement or have a bilateral agreements with individual countries. So they may create and reinstate previous agreements, as they have done with Ireland already and the UK. So that might be recreated with Commonwealth countries like Cyprus and Malta quite quickly. But again, it's something we need to monitor and follow during the transition period. Potentially, healthcare could stop for S1 holders on a reciprocal basis at the end of 2020. So and people relocating after that date might not qualify. So that might be a cut-off period. So relocating after the transition period might also mean you come under different rules. So something to monitor. Look at our other vlogs and videos and downloads for more information on that. It's a complex area and one we need to monitor and change. The ninth point is that when we're working abroad, the social insurance arrangements, the welfare benefits, the UK citizens aren't necessarily entitled to all the benefits and entitlements that they receive in the UK. When you relocate to another country, you've got a qualification period. So a UK expat that doesn't work might not qualify for local benefits until they become a permanent residency after 5 years. Some countries may require contributions to social insurance for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years before benefits can accrue. So an expat, a UK expat relocated to the UK needs to consider that quite carefully when they choose their new country of residence. For EU expats going to the UK, once they're registered and living, they immediately become eligible for National Health Service and potentially for some welfare benefits. That could change. So under the EU rules, the UK has to treat everybody the same, and they could change the rules for non-UK citizens so that there's a qualification period or some other restriction. So we need to monitor that for future moves. The 10th point is UK state pensions or any state pensions and indexation. So for any UK expat in the EU, their state pension is indexed automatically. That's also true for other countries around the world, generally with the countries in which the UK has got social insurance agreements, with some notable exceptions like Canada and New Zealand. Pensions aren't indexed. So the indexation will carry on for a couple of years. That's already been confirmed. However, unless there's a new reciprocal agreement on state pensions between the UK and individual countries in the EU, or with the EU for the whole, then indexing of state pensions will stop wherever you're living and working abroad. So again, a country like Thailand, South Africa, Australia, if you're receiving a UK state pension, you won't get that index going forward. So again, there's something to consider. If you're considering retiring abroad, or if you're already in receipt of a pension abroad, you need to consider how that's going to impact you and monitor the changes to the regulations, the new bilateral agreements that the UK creates in the coming transition period and beyond. So, an exciting time. Nothing has changed with Brexit, but everything will be different. During the transition period, you've still got a time to become an EU expat in the UK or the EU. And if you've got want any advice on residency tax, pensions, business, or residency rights, contact us at Proact Partnership. Download our checklist to keep a tab of that and monitor the things during the years and see how you're affected, and register at our to receive regular updates on how the process changes and evolves during the current year. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll find this useful and you'll share it with a friend, and go to our Facebook page at Living and Working Abroad and give us some feedback about how we're doing and what your question is, and maybe next time we can feature that at our Living and Working Abroad blogs. Thank you very much.
The ProAct Know-How, brought to you by ProAct.